Hi, this is Matt Wimmer from Brody Precision, and in this video we're going to be taking a look at the Loytec Web UI, which is a web user interface for Loytec devices. So what is the Web UI? Like I said, it's an out-of-the-box user interface for Loytec Ethernet connected devices. It allows for a wide variety of configuration and interfacing with points without you having to do anything to set it up and make it usable. And it's accessible via the IP address of the controller that you want to look at. So if we bust out of PowerPoint here and we go into our browser, you can see I'm just going to the IP address of my device, and it prompted me to log in. So I'm logged in as an administrator now, and I can get to all of these settings. The first time you log in with the controller out of the box, it'll ask you to change the password for security's sake, which is a good thing. So first thing that you'll see when you pull up the Web UI is this device info page, which sort of gives you a general overview of everything that's going on in your controller. This controller is relatively new, just out of the box, so it doesn't have a project file in it yet, which is a file or a program that you would create in LStudio. So you'll notice that that piece is empty, but if there was a project file, it would tell you about what the file name was, what units it uses, the timestamp that it was put in, this kind of thing. But even without that, we have a ton of other things that we can do and see what the controller is doing based on. So you can see, again, up here, we're also seeing our project. We have no project file, and we're not using any RS-485, no MP bus, no USB devices, but we have a bunch of stuff configured on our first Ethernet interface. So you can see that my IP address is 1.103, and it's connected. I've got SSH turned on. I've got some other things turned on here like LON over IP, web user interfaces, which is what we're looking at now. BACnet IP is turned on, and OPC XMLDA. And if we go up here now to the next tab, which is our data tab, this gives us a look at all of the data that's in the controller. This would be more fleshed out if you had a program in here, but with the device just being out of the box, we only have a system registers, and this gives us a general overview. These are all basically points that you could look at elsewhere in the configuration of this web UI, but it's the place where you would see your points and data from your program that you wanted to be able to change or see the status of. This is the simple way to do it. Again, system registers is just the stuff that comes out of the box. You would see additional folders available here once you install your own program and set up your own points. Same thing goes for trends. If we had trends, we would be able to pull them up here and look at them here. Scheduler, if we had schedules, we could look at them. Calendars, or if you had repeating things that you wanted to do, you could do them from here. We have no alarm objects set up, and which means we have no alarm logs either. But again, all this stuff, as soon as you add it into your LStudio project, it'll automatically populate on these pages, and you don't have to do any additional configuration to make them show up on these pages. The next piece would be the BACnet piece underneath Commission. Commission gives you a bunch of access to third-party networks. So if, just as an example, I can go in here to the BACnet tab and just do a scan BACnet network, and it'll do a quick scan of the BACnet IP network that's available currently on the network that we're plugged into, and you can see that there's a bunch of other BACnet IP devices here, as well as some devices that are going through a router that it's able to pick up, and we can see that directly from the web UI itself. And then you also have this ability to do this stuff for eKey and EnOcean. If you had an EnOcean USB interface, you can see that it knows that I don't have an interface connected, so it's going to not let me do anything here. Modbus, if we had Modbus enabled, we could do that here. Same with MP bus and OPC. Now, config is where most of our stuff is going to happen. You can see if I go into config, the first piece that's going to bring me up to is the port configuration, which is all of our physical ports on the controller. In my case, this is an LIOB-585, what I'm going to use them all for. I can go into RS-45 and you can see it's disabled here, and I can change it to BACnet MSTP and set my network number and all of those typical settings that you're used to seeing for BACnet directly from this interface. And I'm not going to set that now. MP bus, if you're using that, you could set it. USB, if you had a USB EnOcean radio, you could set that here, and I'm not using one, so I'm actually going to disable that. And then again, with a lot of these port changes, we're going to need to reset the controller. I'm not going to do that right now, but it's good to know that if you're making any changes in this port configuration tab, you're likely going to need to reset the controller after doing so. So IP host, this is just some basic configuration about the device itself on the IP network, what the host name is, what DNS servers you're using, what NTP servers you're using, and the connection keep alive. You could also set up dynamic DNS if you wanted to do that here. If you were on a network that your IP address could potentially change for external access to your controller, dynamic DNS will allow you to do that a little bit easier so that you're just using a domain name and the service is keeping track of what the IP address is. So underneath our Ethernet port, we have a ton of options here. We, most importantly, probably have this port mode, which allows us to set up how we want to use the port on the controller. We can set it up, in this case, it's just that Ethernet 1 is always going to be a separate network, but if I go to Ethernet 2, I can make it a switch, so basically 1 and 2 are on the same network, or I can make it a separate network from 1, so that 1 and 2 are not going to talk to each other directly. And then the next piece is our TCP IP configuration. We can set that up to use DHCP, or we can set it up manually with statics. Important thing to note here is you're probably going to want to set NTP servers for time, either here or underneath IP hosts, underneath NTP servers, because that's how the controller is going to keep in sync time-wise. Obviously, in order to use those pieces, you're going to need either a local network NTP server that's giving you the time, or have access to the internet to use something like these publicly accessible NTP servers. Then we also have the ability to turn on FTP and Telnet if that's necessary. SSH is on by default. You can turn that off, though, if you're not using it. We've got some other networks that we can turn on and off. Our web UI we can't turn off. Same with HTTP. HTTPS on and off. Obviously, you should have that on. Secure connections are always a good thing. An interesting feature is there's this VNC for your LCD screen. So if you wanted to see what was going on with the LCD screen without physically being able to see the LCD screen, you could use this VNC to do this. It's interesting because VNC was made to let you do remote desktop kind of stuff. And in this case, Loytec is using it just to let you see and maneuver around on the LCD screen, which is kind of a neat little feature. Most of the things that you can do on the LCD screen, you can do from this interface. So the use case for that, I think, is probably pretty small. But if you wanted to be able to walk people through things or something like that, it's nice to know that that feature's there. We have the ability to turn on Modbus TCP if we wanted to. We've got remote packet capture stuff. So if you were having issues on a network and you wanted to be able to capture some network traffic and throw it into Wireshark later on, you could very easily turn this on and have the controller do that packet capture for you and then export the file out so that you could look at it in Wireshark on your machine. We've got BACnet IP set up here on this Ethernet port. And again, it has the typical settings that I think most people are used to seeing for BACnet IP. And then specific port information for LStudio. If you wanted to change that, you could. You just would obviously need to know that it's different on the LStudio side as well. SNMP if you're going to use that. OPC XMLDA and OPC UA. Both of those on and off if you want to. And then Ethernet 2, we can set for whichever we want to use there. If we're doing any wireless stuff, we can use that here. If we have a cellular modem plugged in, we can set that information up. And then we can turn on VPN if we want to as well. Next piece is email. This is just outgoing email information. SMS, if we're using an LTE modem, we could do SMS, which is texting directly over that LTE modem. System is where we're going to set our time information. Important thing to note about that as well is you're going to want to set your latitude and longitude of the location that your device is installed at as well, because of the way the clock works in the controller, that it uses that information to give you time. And you can set your default units and things here as well. And if you're activating the IoT license for your controller, this is where you would plug in that PIN number that Loytec would give you to activate that. And then next we have some basic LStudio and LogicCAD configuration things. And then we have scripting and Node-RED. Both of these require the IoT license in order to use. Node-RED is the block programming that's based off of JavaScript that you could do through the browser and then interface with your controller directly with. Then we've got our more BACnet settings, some more network-specific settings. Passwords are where you're going to change your password information. You can see that there are 3 types of accounts that are on the controller by default, and you can change the passwords for all 3 of them. Certificates, if you're using SSL and you want to create your own certificate and have it signed, or just create your own certificate and have it self-signed, you would do all of that from here. With the USB port on the controller, you have the ability to plug in a thumb drive and back up trend data and things like that, and you would do that from here. Backup and restore lets you back up the data on the controller, and you can include a bunch of information optionally with that. And then from this page, you also do your restore. And then on the VPN page, we have the ability to be a client for OpenVPN, which would mean that we're connecting to an external server somewhere, or we can be a very simple server and have users connect directly to our controller through OpenVPN. And if we go to the firmware page, a nice thing about the firmware on these controllers is that you can update the controller's firmware directly from this page over the internet. You don't have to go out and grab a file, the latest firmware. This will go out, check to see what the latest available firmware is, tell you if you have a new one available, and then do the update. And then with this checkbox checked, it'll also do a backup of the current configuration of the controller before it starts doing the firmware, so it groups everything together in one place. We've got some more EnOcean configuration here if you're using EnOcean. And then a cool little feature from the web UI is you have the ability to upload your own documentation to the controller, which, you know, if you had a program in here and you wanted to include some drawings or a sequence of operations, things like that, you could upload that directly to the controller so it lives on the controller along with the program which is running itself. And then when you upload it here, it'll then show up on this documentation tab so that a user could come in and look at that information later. And then we've got some shade information too if you're doing window shade control. Statistics has a ton of statistic information. We're just going to kind of gloss over this. Largely, it's giving you override points, data on your different networks, your IP settings, routing tables, very in-depth information that we might not normally be used to seeing, but it's very helpful if you're going to debug things later down the road. LWeb would be for if you have a program in your controller and you also have graphics associated with it, you'd be able to pull up those graphics through the LWeb tab. And then the LIOB tab, in this case, because I'm using an LIOB-585, lets us see all of our inputs and outputs, what the status is of them, and then I can come in here and put them into manual control and override the output directly from the screen as well. And then on top of that, there's also a built-in I/O test mode, which lets you run through all of your I/O and put it into manual mode, make sure it works the way you expect it to. And then if it does, you can come in here and say, okay, that worked. It'll automatically say when you tested it, and then you can add in a comment if you wanted to. And then when you're done, you can export this out as a CSV and use it later as a checkout document or something like that. And we talked about this documentation tab already. And then our reset tab lets us reboot the controller, clear configuration data, reset our set points back to their default values and reboot the controller, that kind of thing. And then the contact page has the basic contact info for Loytec, and then we have a logout. So that's a basic overview of the web UI for a Loytec LIOB-585. Hope that was helpful for you. Keep an eye out for more videos just like this one on bptechcenter.com and our YouTube page at Brody Precision. Thanks a lot.